Ron and Farooq, thanks so much for joining me on this episode of Concentrating on Chromatography. I appreciate it.
Good to be here.
Thank you, David.
And Farooq, you're returning as a guest, which I greatly appreciate. There was a great response from your first episode, so I'm excited to dig into some more topics related to just peaks in general today.
Thank you.
What is the concept behind peak modeling and separation science for someone who might be new to this?
Basically, the idea that chromatography isn't going to be a complete answer to any kind of separation problem. It's apparent when you first run the first chromatogram and two peaks are overlapping one another, because immediately you've got a problem with how are you going to separate them. And they would drop a perpendicular where the two meet and they would measure the area under each side. And surprisingly, people are still doing what they did last century in a lot of the chromatography. So the science of mathematical modeling of peaks has been around about as long, but there is still some very simplistic methods that people seem very happy with, and that's fine. But we would prefer the much more rigorous analytical approach where you go in and get as accurate a measure of each component as possible.
And can you briefly explain the entire process to a practicing chromatographer in terms of peak modeling beginning to end?
I guess I would start with we there are certain pieces of digital signal processing that we try to avoid. And one of those would be like going in and trying to smooth or denoise the data before you start, simply because when you go in and you do peak modeling, yeah, you produce a noise-free result. And because it's a statistical method, you don't typically want to do that. But there are certain things you absolutely do want to do in pre-processing your data before you start. And one of them is just basically baseline subtraction. You will almost always see a baseline as in chromatographic data. You I think you always see one in terms of spectroscopic data. So you want to go in and try to produce as close to a zero baseline as you can, because peaks decay to a zero baseline. And so you want your data to basically coincide with the peaks you're trying to measure. Otherwise, you'll be distorting your information with the amount of baseline that you have in your system. So the first step you would do is clean up your data by removing whatever kind of baselines you have in your system. Once you have that done, you can go directly to the peak modeling, which is pretty much a two-step process. You have to detect your peaks, which is very simple if they're smooth and each of them have a nice little local maxima.
Mhm.
Actually quite hard when the data are noisy, because you have to basically find some way to make sure you're not looking at multiple peaks when you have a lot of little spikes right at the top of the apex of the peak, and when the peaks are overlapping. And an overlapping peak can be a very obvious case where you've got a doublet with two very visible peaks, or it can be pretty difficult where you're living in the one peak is living in the shoulder of another one, and your only indication that there are two peaks there is that the shape looks wrong, or there's
Mhm.
something unusual about the shape. In fact, if you go all the way back to Carl Pearson's original work, more than a century ago, I think it was largely based on him looking at two slow distributions where it just didn't look right.
Mhm.
And he basically went in and long before computers ever came into the scene, he worked out a way to determine how much of each of those two components were present in a mixture of two. So the science goes back a very long time with some very brilliant people behind it. Part of the science is just getting the peaks detected correctly, and then once you do, the computers are so fast these days, so capable of nonlinear modeling, don't look for granted. It is such a basic piece of the toolkit these days. But even a great many people aren't using it. So it's maybe this podcast will help a few people get more interested in doing so.
And I'm glad you touched on that, Ron, because we definitely wanted to get into the historical motivation and what information we can extract from that process. Is it as simple as people needed a measuring stick to be able to say, hey, this doesn't look right? Is that kind of where fitting peaks comes from?
In some ways, I guess it's an art as much of as a science, because I've done it so much that I can look at something and within a few seconds know something wasn't right. and that there are people that don't have much. There's an experience element to it because the person who goes out and runs a few weeks worth of chromatography probably won't have a problem. It's not like this is something you have to invest a lifetime in. You just need to get some sense for what the real world looks like. It's like anything science. What does the real world look like? And if you don't know, and you see this in all over, surprisingly, from presumably very good researchers. They don't have that experience. And so you see things that are very questionable that get published that if they had just a little more experience going out, that you wouldn't see it at all.
And Farouk, would you be able to guide readers regarding the commercial software that can be used for peak modeling?
So, I mean, the master of peak modeling is sitting with us, Ron Brown. So, he has written two software which I've been using for almost 11 to 12 years. One is PeakFit, and he has recently launched PeakLab, which is a far better and improved version of what PeakFit was. And PeakFit has been used in by spectroscopists, by chromatographers, and by even in defense as well. So if you want to develop things on your own, you can use MATLAB, but you have to get peak functions, models from somewhere. And Ron is very nice in one sense that he has written details of about more than 200 peak functions on his website. And you can model those in MATLAB and Python. Origin Pro offers peak models and Igor Pro as well. So they're common and popular software that you can use. But in terms of comprehensiveness, in terms of baseline correction, denoising, I would prefer PeakLab as such.
Yeah, it's probably worth noting that the instrument manufacturers have had a vested interest in selling more advanced instrumentation rather than
Mm,
software because you can basically take something and run it out of one column and into a separate column in a separate instrument and resolve these individual peaks. That they don't
right.
actually require a mathematical procedure to separate them. You could just spend
Mm,
another $30,000 and you can have your peaks nicely separated from the instrumentation. So
mhm.
there has been a certain market, honestly, there has been a certain market resistance. And I heard this firsthand from a number of people in the industry to basically putting the nonlinear modeling talking about putting a man on the moon. It's not that kind of rocket science. It is simply, it involves a lot of work. I won't deny that, but there's also a motivation, not so much to get into this kind of science because there are
I
other
think
ways you can solve you can solve some of this.
Ron has raised an important point. Majority of the chromatography software are using denoisers which are at least 70 years old, or manual baseline correction, or peak skimming, tangential, things like that. And then they're really old methodology. So he's right that instrumentation technology has improved a lot, but the software side is still far behind. At
Yeah,
least I would say 50 years behind.
I agree with that. Jim Wade, who produced the NLC model, which is probably the most sophisticated mathematical model for chromatography that ever
Mhm.
came to pass, makes a joke that this chromatography is still in the last century and they just took the scissors away from the people and the Mettler balances, where you would go and cut out the peaks from base and then put them on a balance to weigh them to determine how much of each component was. His joke was that science is not progressing as fast as it could, to put it
Mhm.
politely. So there are certain things we can show you that go far beyond the current state of the art. And there are
Mhm.
others that there's a lot going on in this industry that's still pretty primitive, if we
Yes.
were to be honest about it.
Yeah, I have to say that at the American Society of Mass Spec conference last week, I certainly went to a lot of the press conferences and breakfast seminars and was on the expo hall. And yeah,
Right.
there's so much of a focus on the latest and greatest instrumentation, but I can't recall hearing about someone discussing their latest version of built-in software that comes with
Mhm.
those units.
Right. Half of the analytical chemistry is post processing. Once you have acquired good data, 50% of the work is post processing of the data, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where I was hoping we could go in terms of what data pre-processing is required
Hmm.
for peak modeling, Farouk.
That's a good question. Ron has hinted at the point that signal processing or peak modeling is not a substitute for bad experiments. You must be experienced in that field. For example, there's an unfortunate trend in pharmaceutical industry, or people who think that we have seen the HPLC and we can click a few buttons and we know how to run a chromatogram or a mass spec. In computer science, there's a concept of GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. If you do bad experiments, you will have very poor peak modeling, right? So have a, we should assume that the person who has generated the data has the right detector settings, has used the right column, has used the right mobile phase, has used the right wavelengths or mass spec settings, and so on. And then we should do the data processing. So that you, once you have that data, as Ron had mentioned, that noise is the number one enemy of any analytical measurement. So, and there are two types of noise. One is the high frequency noise, which fast oscillations, and then there is slow drift, which is called the baseline. So baselines have to be removed because peak statistical peak models do not have baselines built in. And of course, noise hurts peak detection as well. So if for peak modeling, you must know the number of peaks beforehand. And there are different algorithms to detect the number of peaks. And if you have more noise, you detect false peaks. So you have false discovery rate and such on. So baseline correction followed by good denoising is pretty much all you need besides good experimental data for peak modeling. Yes.
I think I already know the answer to this next question, but speaking of all the great mass spectrometers I saw last week, they're state of the art pieces of equipment. Is there still a need for fitting peaks today? And is
Mhm.
peak modeling specific to certain detectors?
I certainly think so, just from the standpoint of the fact that, yeah, particularly the kind of business Farooq is, and he sees a lot of isomers, a lot of enantiomers that have basically the same mass. They basically fragment in about the same way. So from a mass spec point of view, they're identical, but we know
Mhm.
they're not. Two isomers can be massively different in the pharmaceutical industry in terms of their impact on the human body. So you do want to get that right. So the chromatography is still very important, and still, I'm not sure how much mass spec is, maybe Fruit knows, how much mass spec is actually done without the LC these days. But
It's a good question because mass spectrometrists have been dreaming that they can get rid of chromatography for a long time, maybe more than 5 decades, that we don't need chromatographers anymore, we don't need chromatography or a column. But the key point is not all molecules ionize in a mass spec. Mass spec may be blind to a lot of molecules. They may stick anywhere in the steel part, component parts, metallic parts. And second thing is that if you have co-luting components, they can affect each other's ionization efficiency. So your quantification will be completely compromised if you don't use a column. So currently, I don't see anything that which can make chromatography obsolete. It's there, and it's going to be there for another 50 years.
we'll show you something today associated with mass spec that combines the chromatography, the peak fitting, and the mass spec in a way that hasn't been done before. That shows that the science can progress forward, and there really is a lot of utility in using the different capabilities of each kind of analysis in tandem with one another.
Farouk, people use the term deconvolution frequently in chromatography.
Mhm.
I think it might commonly be somewhat misused as a term. And it would also be good if you could just touch on the usage of the term, but also how is it different from peak modeling?
Because as you have recently attended a mass spectrometry conference, they love the word deconvolution when they're actually extracting peak profiles corresponding to a certain mass, right? That's extracted on chromatogram and HPLC, LC, or MS. Um, this is not deconvolution. Deconvolution is a very specific process. Like physicists and mathematicians know this term very well because they deal with it almost every day. Deconvolution means that you know that something is distorting the peak shape, a true peak shape. And once we know that broadening or distortion, how can we reverse that process in order to get the original peak shape? So that is true deconvolution. It's very involved mathematically. Let's say we have four partially over resolved peaks or overlapping peaks. And when people decompose that sum into individual peaks, they say they have deconvoluted it. A better word would be peak decomposition or curve resolution or curve fitting. But when you communicate, since I communicate with a lot of mathematicians all the time, they always warn me that this is not correct. This deconvolution has a separate meaning. So this is a warning for my chromatography fellows, is that don't use this term until unless you are doing true deconvolution.
You think of, I kind of think of true deconvolution as dealing with the real world distortions that you see in the
Mhm.
data. Like if you look at spectroscopy data, its native peak shape is Lorentzian. But
Mhm.
whenever you actually see a peak in the spectroscopic sciences, it's always a void function or tends to
Mhm.
be, which means
Mhm.
there's a certain Gaussian character to it. That Gaussian comes from your lenses, your mirrors. If you're looking at light coming from distant stars, it could come from a redshift because everything is moving apart from you as the observer. All of those items produce a different shape, and that shape is the distortion in the true signal that would exist if you were measuring it directly at the source with no distortion in a perfect instrument. Deconvolution typically is to clean up something. If you want to deconvolve something, you want to try to see the true picture and try to get rid of all the distortions that the measurement systems added. But
Mhm.
that is not, it has obviously nothing whatsoever to do with peak separation, other than the fact that the Gaussian distortion on top of a Lorentzian, they're both peaks. But
Right.
what you are dealing with is what is the true signal and what has distorted it, and can you deconvolution, if it's done right, will separate those. And that
Mhm.
exists in chromatography because the fluid systems all have that little right side tailing, and that
Mhm.
comes from the fluid flow systems having a native kind of distortion in your system. And if you can remove this IRF or instrument response function, you get to see the signal as if you had a perfect flow system
Mhm.
without the distortion that's there. So that's how Farooq and I see convolution. It's how mathematicians see it. But most of the people in the analytic chemists, they will call peak separation deconvolution. And I've seen it for decades. I don't think anything's going to change that. But maybe your podcast can.
Hey, awareness is always part of the solution. And I surveyed several papers and found one that stated there are about 200 peak models. Among these choices, how do we determine which peak model is correct or best, and how should new users assess this?
I spent years redoing the models for PeakLab based upon what we did back in PeakFit decades before. And on those, we actually had the Harvard van der Linde, the nonlinear chromatography, the EMG models, things that are still being considered today as a leading edge kind of fitting. It's not a simple kind of process. It's not something I would recommend a lot of people go in unless they want to invest a massive amount of time. The models are complicated. And the other side of it is humans tend to be very sloppy. There's a lot of science that has been produced in the chromatographic field that I would call, if I'm being polite, I would call it incomplete because there are a lot of models out there that are not, uh, really weren't fleshed out well. They're valid, but they're not valid. Now, when I say something like that, I know it sounds pretty hypocritical, but the basis behind that is, I'll give you an example. Back when I was in college, which goes back a very long time, I had a professor, I can still remember it, Philip Wahab, Purdue University in the 70s. He taught us that if we did not balance mass in any problem we ever solved, we needed to check out right now from the chemical engineering curriculum and go find another field of science. Just leave. You don't belong here if you don't understand that concept, was his. And I still remembered that decades later. And then I would see these models that chromatographers would produce, and they didn't balance mass. You could have more or less coming out of the column than what you put in. There's something irrational about that, right? If you just think about it, there is something that doesn't, and it's not that the original models are wrong, but they were never completed because you can integrate any kind of mass and you can normalize that, or any kind of peak shape. You can integrate it. And once you integrate it, you can divide by that and you have a unit model. It's what statistical people did in the 18th, 17th century. 18th century, it's been a very long time, but it doesn't happen on some of these chromatographic models. And when I saw them, I wouldn't touch them. I would not put them in my software because I knew that that's just bad science. So the thing that I did when I put models into the program was I made sure that the models were at least sound, and I built them on top of people that were, in my mind, absolute geniuses. The Harvard Vanderlyn people that didn't get a lot of press back in the 1960s, they are the true pioneers of the modeling science today because what they did then holds up, and it holds up even on a molecular level today. They did two things. They dealt with the inlet volume effects on chromatographic instruments, and they dealt with concentration effects. And they did that with almost nothing in the way of digital computers, just having to work from math. They had to do this in an overview kind of absorption isotherm kind of basis for deriving this. But it was actually derived theoretically in a beautiful way 20 some years later. And that was in the kinetic model, the Wade Thomas kinetic model that came out decades later. Let me just bring up one model here. And this is the generalized HVL model. So here's a model that Hartog Vanderlyn produced back in the 1960s that has been generalized to use a generalized normal pore density instead of a normal density. Sounds pretty simple, but when you actually look at the math, which is what in the model I'm showing you right here, it's far from simple. It's just too laborious. It's difficult. And again, the key is you do want these models to have a perfect mass balance. Everything that goes into the column comes out. You can't have some missing component somewhere in the system.
Ron,
That's the
you
point.
want to
I'm just,
mention,
I'm just,
Ron, you also wanted to mention the statistical test, I think, which you apply to choose from a range of models, right? What test were you talking about?
yes, in fact, I will share that. One of the privileges I've had of working with a lot of people over a lot of years is I got to meet some pretty great statistical scientists. I got to work with a fellow named Lloyd Nelson. He was General Electric's chief statistician for quite a few years and then went back to work as a statistician again after he retired. He and I both agreed on and worked together across years. The F statistic that statisticians love to use as a general method does a beautiful job of sorting the value of adding an additional parameter to a given model. There are a lot of information criterion, the Gaiki, the Bayesian. I love the minimum description length just because it has the F statistic already built into it. There's a lot of different ways you can look at different models because some of them might be a 4 parameter peak model, some might be a 5, some might be a 6. And you want to be able to come up with some kind of statistical metric to know, am I actually getting the best model for the data that I have? I'm not just getting a better model because I threw more modeling power at the problem. It is actually producing a significant benefit. And so that's largely what I've been using for decades. I wouldn't recommend anybody use anything else. Lloyd is no longer with us, but he would make that same pronouncement. And he was a brilliant statistician of our modern era. And he felt the same. You want to use intelligent methods to try to gauge whether you're being successful or not when you make a given change. But these are not simple models. And adding the smallest change to the core peak within this HVL adds a great deal of complexity to a model. This is one of the simpler models in the current PeakLab. So it basically, we're at a point where you should trust the experience. And what I tried to do with this was just to write on the shoulders of people who were really geniuses in years past and just extend it using the statistical procedures that are available today. So we're not reinventing the wheel. All we're trying to do is just add some non-ideality to what's superb work that was done by just the geniuses of the field in ages past. So we try to respect the work that's been done. Well, bear with me for just a second. I'm trying to stop this sharing here.
That's my whole strategy with the podcast. Try to learn from people who are much smarter than me. So.
There are some brilliant people out there in the chromatographic field, and they're not really that well recognized. It's shocking the number of times the papers that I know made all the difference in the world today in terms of chromatographic modeling, and not the ones you're going to see massively cited with massive citations out there in the field. And obviously, it shouldn't work that way.
Mhm.
Farooq is a big one on believing that the people who've actually contributed to our science should be properly recognized by the people of the current era. And he published like 60 papers, and I don't think he rarely publishes a paper without trying to give credit to the people that he's built the work upon and making clear how much that those people do deserve recognition for the work they did
Yes.
in the past.
Credit is very important in science and it does not hurt. And I always try to find out who did it first.
And switching gears, can peak modeling determine the areas of completely overlapped peaks? And what are the strengths and limitations there?
The answer is no. Chromatography by itself cannot separate two peaks at full loops. Just like mass spec can't separate two components that have exactly two isomers that have exactly the same mass and fragment and exactly the same pattern. Each field will have its own limitations, each field will have its own strengths, but you cannot do a one-dimensional kind of problem solving with chromatography and get it if you have two peaks completely correlate at the same time. What it's doing is producing a slightly different distortion in the shape of what you think there. You might be able to discern enough to say, photography will say something's not right. You can look at that and
Mm.
say, there's probably two items there. Just like in mass spec, you can see two things that are in the same zone of an LC mass spec and gold. That there's two components there. Well, that's photography can give you a hint, but the nonlinear fitting will not solve that. So you need to use some more advanced kinds of, you basically have to just get intelligent. You can't just rely on one method to give you the same answer. And so what you have to do is you have to go to a second dimension to solve the problem. You can't just use the time dimension of the chromatographic separation. You have to use mass as in a mass spec, combine the two. You have to use a PDA, DAD kind of detector to be able to see what's happening at all the different wavelengths. So you're adding the absorption of the species to the actual coelution, the elution time of the chromatography. Two peaks perfectly co-eluting. We can erase one of them and just see the other one that remains. That's a lovely technique. Farooq introduced me to that one, and it's in PeakLab as a consequence of his contribution. And the other is the MCR ALS, the alternating least squares method, where you're going in and trying to look at all of the different chromatograms you see across all the different wavelengths and sort out what do each of the individual molecules look like. And that's a very powerful method, and it's very promising in terms of what it can do. And there are more ways you can get to that. There are ways to solve that problem, but you've left the last century and you're pretty much at the leading edge of this one. At least that's my view. Farouk, your perspective is
I
on
think
this.
yes, you have to use the second dimension and for getting more information, right? As I said, you should not intentionally overlap or you cannot do bad chromatography and think modeling will or MCR ALS will extract the peaks. No, you should try your best. And then when it fails, then you come to digital methods. And I've used the term digital chromatography for that because you're doing post processing of the data digitally on your computer.
If you look at this is you've got chromatography going across the x-axis. The second variable is now the wavelength. So each one of these traces, as I would go across in time, would be a separate chromatogram. So this particular data set here is obviously there's a large number of components here. Some are present at a very trace level, some are present at a very predominant level, but all of these are what can be done in a single chromatographic separation if you just save your 3D data. So if you just save the 3D DAD PDA data in a liquid chromatography, you can use this particular information to try to separate the peaks that are completely co-eluted. And for example, if they completely co-elute at 220 or 210, at one of the wavelengths where just about everything absorbs, it's very possible there's two other wavelengths out there where one component has a principal absorbance, the other has nothing. The second component has at a very different frequency, and the other one isn't there. So we're going out there and picking a wavelength, two different wavelengths. You can often get that separation of two co-eluting peaks very simply. And this is widely used, and the very competent, intelligent people out there that really want to use the 3D data for all it's worth will be doing this kind of thing right now. And it helps to be able to have a full picture, like you see here in this one, because it can make a difference. Now, there are other places where you don't have that option. Okay, this particular one, as you can see from the drum console, and you can see these all have, you don't have a clue by looking at this thing. You're not going to be able to easily pick a wavelength that's going to sort two components. And because these are, you see all of the individual components, one of these has 8 stereoisomers, the other has 4. That's a pretty complicated problem, and you can't just look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of these and have a clear picture of how do I separate these? But there are techniques, and what I'm showing you here, this particular method produced two individual components. You see the yellow component, you see the white component. It's doing a beautiful job of showing you each of the 2 molecules and the stereoisomers that you're capable of registering in the separation. But even one of these has 4, one of these have 8. In these separations, you see a 3 and a 7, simply because 2 of these are co-eluting and coming out in the chromatography in the same place. You can get into some pretty sophisticated kind of technologies, but you're very much looking at the present time. And the other item I wanted to show was that with the 3D data, you can, if you look at the first derivative, again, this is the method Farooq helped me to see, you see these little zones between each of these elements in this same separation. Each place where you see the little 0 point in the first derivative, if I were to look at just that particular spectra, that particular component will be gone. So by basically doing chromatography of the first derivative instead of the raw data, you can, at each of these places where you see zeros, you can go in and you can erase that individual component from the data. Which means, if there's 2 components there at the same, you can see this one clearly has 2 different components that are in the same place. And here you see the same kind of issue. And the thing is, you're doing something incredible, actually. You're going into finished data where you have it's reading one and you're basically erasing one and keeping the other. And of course, you can do that same kind of thing. Now, this is a mass spec trace where watching the chromatography is in the cyan, but you have all of this information in the mass spec. I'm looking at it here as a 3D profile. If you actually go in and you can use that, you can produce a different kind of separation where you're doing a peak fitting of each individual component that was each individual extracted ion chromatogram. And if you're consolidating them correctly and conserving mass, which is something that hasn't been given a lot of attention, you can produce what's in this lower axis here, where you can see the individual components in the chromatography using the mass spec detector and determine their actual quantity. So I won't get into how we do that. It's complicated. You're pulling out each of the individual raw strands of the XICs. You're modeling each of those, and you're aggregating them. It's a fairly complicated kind of process, but it works and it works well. And when you get into the current technologies, you pretty much have to look at the fact you're looking at that second dimension. And when you get into that second dimension, it gets really interesting. It gets exciting, interesting, because you're doing things that have not been considered until this present decade of science. So you're really doing things that haven't been done before. You asked about 2 peaks that are right on top of each other in the chromatography. How can you reconcile those? And you can't always reconcile them with mass spec simply because they have the same neutral mass and they have the same fragmentation. There are a lot of problems out there that are fairly challenging, but solving those can be pretty exciting and good science.
And the key point is that the 2D data is underutilized. HPLC, majority of them have emission scans, excitation scans, absorption spectra, PDA detector, mass spec, and so on. And people don't use them as such. There is a lot of rich information hidden there.
I was working with one of the pharma companies over in Europe, and they huge IT team. I suppose every pharma company does. But their IT team basically was looking at one of the vendors of chromatography, and they wanted to get the PDA 3D data out. They just wanted to do it. They wanted to get it out so that they could do the kind of thing we were just showing you. And they couldn't work it out. And it could be just that vendor largely has made it impossible. You can go out and pull out individual wavelengths after the fact if you save the data, but you cannot go out and pull the data in one fell swoop and go in and use some of the technologies. And again, now these are interesting kinds of problems to solve because there is nothing like being able to go in and get a mathematical answer without not having to go back into the lab again. Because there are times where, and I've just seen some of this where I work with people, they went back into the lab, they went back into the lab, they went back into the lab. And after about 3 months, they didn't still have the answer they were hoping to have for the paper they wanted to publish.
Mhm.
And yet you could go in and with the kind of mathematical modeling in minutes, you could have an answer that might be good to a 1% error, which is good enough for the kind of science people. You probably wouldn't do much better going out in a much more elaborate kind of laboratory kind of analysis. So yeah, the mathematical modeling, I believe, has a place. But again, as Farooq said, it has been grossly underutilized by just about everybody except the PhD physicists in the world.
True.
The PhD physicists live in their own universe, and none of this stuff is in the slightest uncomfortable for them. In fact, it makes their day.
In the sense that if you have complete overlap, then peak modeling does not
Um,
work because you cannot detect the peaks, and the peak detection is usually done by second derivatives, right?
oh,
You
okay.
derivatives cannot resolve a completely overlap peak. If you have a shoulder, one third visible shoulder, yeah, then you can. And then again, you have to use two-dimensional matrices instead of one-dimensional data, just absorbance at a single wavelength. You must have a full matrix of the data, and then you do multivariate curve resolution, alternating least squares, or derivative spectrum chromatogram, which is based on zero crossings of derivatives, and like this methods.
And I guess I do more with just the chromatography. That chromatograph data I showed you from the mass spec, that particular data, the column that they're doing there is a 2-hour separation. They are willing to go out and do a 2-hour separation to have as much separation as possible on the chromatography, and at the same time run concentrations that are the map that challenge the analyzer so that they can see the trace amounts of some of the smallest components in their mixture. So the science work together. That's a good example of how liquid mass spectrometry can go very happily together because you can really push the limits of one and exploit the benefits of the other. And not everyone will do that. So find a lot of this. Someone will go out and do a beautiful overtrap separation or analysis of 5-minute run. There's a lot more you can do on the chromatographic side to help that out if you needed to. And so it's an art. It's an art as much as it is a science. And when you get to this leading edge I'm talking about, it may be closer to all. So because there are a lot of ways to get to the right answer once you add that second dimension.
And I know that you're both involved in the latest developments in the science behind peak modeling. What's the latest and greatest, and what's the most powerful model that's been developed so far?
Part of what you have to deal with now in chromatography is that there is very little isocratic. Almost all of the chromatography is gradient, simply because the peaks are much narrower. If it's done well, you can get rid of much of the instrument response function distortion in your signal. So you can produce some very lovely chromatography by doing gradients. But the moment you deal with a variable mobile phase, suddenly things get pretty complicated.
Hmm.
And the model I showed you, which dealt with third moment skew, does a nice job of dealing with columns that have an asymmetric kind of packing. Or you're doing a narrow bore column and you've got particles at a different concentration along the wall of the column and you have the signal. But they're not going to help you with the fact that your mobile phase is dramatically changing over the course of the run. It's the same with thermal gradient GC. Your peaks are going to, even in a narrow elution, is what the front edge of the peak is going to see a different force for the separation than the leading and the trailing edges are going to have two different components.
I can simplify what Ron is saying. for our general public is that the latest state of the art, or state of the art development is that all instruments, spectroscopic instruments or chromatographic instruments, mass, they will distort a true peak shape. And so we must develop models which incorporate peak distortion by the instruments. That has been completely neglected for a long time. And I think there was only one popular model, which was exponentially modified Gaussian from late 60s, early 70s. And from the early 1900s, it was called Voigt. It was developed by a German mathematician or physicist, which is a convolution of a Lorentzian and a Gaussian. So those are the two popular models, and they are. Ron has solved this problem maybe 30 years ago. He
Yeah, pretty
found
much.
found exact solution of the void peak profile. But if you look at commercial software on who are doing X-ray modeling, Raman spectroscopy, they are using very primitive Gaussian Lorentzian sums or Gaussian Lorentzian products. So people have to update and you search the literature. People read, my friends, read. There is no shortcut.
I'm trying to summarize this really quickly. For one, I'm showing you what is a model that does both the third and the fourth moments. If any of your readers knew Pienaar, they probably got a lengthy education of the value of moments in chromatography. Having a fourth moment is not a lightweight option. I did that here. You saw the previous model I showed you. Look at the size of this one. This works. And this doesn't even have an IRF to deal with the instrumental distortions. It's just dealing with the fact that you want the non-ideality of the packing in the column and you want the gradient effect on the column. You're not even dealing with the distortions yet in the flow system. But this model will describe this to an astonishing measure of accuracy. And it's just simply taking the science that existed and adding a third and a fourth moment component to it from the statistical sciences. And it works beautifully. Okay, let's go back to what I wanted to show. This is the twice generalized model. When you generalize one time, you're adding a third moment. If you generalize twice, you're adding a fourth moment. The fourth moment deals with the compaction that occurs in a gradient spin separation. And you can just see the model that I've been showing you on the screen here. It's not a lightweight kind of system. It's not something you want to go on and try to develop. We put the best of the statistical sciences with the best of the chromatography sciences together to produce the model. And all it did was add two parameters, a third moment, a non-ideality to deal with the skewness of your system, and a fourth moment, ideality to non-ideality to deal with its compaction or compression of peak shapes arising from gradient chromatography. To my knowledge, this hasn't been addressed and it hasn't been published as yet. Farooq and I are trying to get around to that. But it does represent the state of the art, we believe, in terms of the current model. It's general and it deals with expanding orthogonal moments to higher dimensions, which is about the optimum you can realize when you're dealing with mathematical modeling.
It probably doesn't surprise either one of you that a lot of the conversations I've had over the past 2 years have included some element of AI discussion. The
Mhm.
only episode that was really devoted to AI was my interview with Dwight Stoll talking about retention data and how that can be used with AI modeling. But I'd love to hear any thoughts you have on how you expect AI to help chromatographers in general moving forward.
Cause a science historian, I can tell you, AI has been used in chromatography for more than 50 years. If you look at the papers from the 60s and the late 80s, early 80s as well, they were trying to develop methods with computer aided methods. And how can we predict? How can we teach the mass spectrometer? And Savitsky, Gole were using computers at that time. So it's not new as such. So it's at the apex, it's the hype cycle. Like AI at the peak of its hype, right? But you have to read history so that you can humble yourself. Don't think that I'm the first one or I'm doing it for the first time. I occasionally receive papers where I see that we are doing this for the first time, and I tell them no. from the 70s, please look at this report, look at this report, and they still discard it because that hurts their novelty. So yes, so we have to acknowledge the work of the past and then move on. So you can differentiate classical AI, which was like not the generative AI, which is recent. Generative AI in the sense that it can talk to you, right? So it can convert as if Ron is talking to me or if you are talking to me. It can give me suggestions. So current generative AI is I usually call it as a mathematical miracle, in the sense that it is revolutionizing everything in good way and bad way as well. I can say the bad part is that every researcher is now dependent on AI, especially the young ones, and they are doing very simple tasks like dilutions, calibration curves using AI, and it is hurting their thinking so badly that's beyond imagination. So it you will see this effect maybe in 4 or 5 years, just like we see the COVID era students. They studied at home using online classes. Their background is quite weak. They did not attend classes, they did not do labs. In the same way, I think it's better that older people or more experienced people use AI, in the sense that it should not be used in elementary calculations or elementary work, right? Second thing is that AI, people always complain that AI is giving wrong answers or it's not useful. But the thing is that, again, without having a context or having a background in mathematics or in your field, you cannot have a good, valuable conversation with AI. For example, Ron is of a previous generation. He's lucky that he studied in the 70s. His mathematics is really good. He was not into AI, and I told him initially he made fun of it. Now he's the biggest fan of AI, and he's using AI to write software, part of the software, and things which he was not comfortable with before, right? But he had a very good foundation in mathematics, in C++, and he immediately learned Python. And then with Python and AI, you can use it. So AI is only useful for a prepared mind. That's what I always emphasize. If I'm in grade 8, I cannot invent a new peak model with AI, right? You have to have background. You need to know the terms, because AI can readily take you into a rabbit hole. It can mislead you. You have to hold the reins like a horse. A term which I occasionally use is AI could be a clever Hans. It was a German horse who appeared to do mathematics, who could do arithmetic in the early 1900s. So yes, so AI has good uses, bad uses, but for me, it has revolutionized the way I used to work, in the sense that I would contact mathematicians or I would post questions to in different forums of experts, like math forum where PhDs were there, and you could not get answer because they were missing the chemical context, right? Most of the time my answer, I did not get any reasonable answer because they may know the background but they do not know the chemical problem. AI is a very good colleague, a good scientific colleague who knows chemistry, physics, signal processing, mathematics, calculus, optimization, MATLAB, Python. It's a good friend, as I would say, right? And the only concern is that it's getting more and more expensive. AI is not cheap. So students cannot afford a good AI. Like cheap AI or free AI is not as good at all. You have to pay. So either you get $100 subscription or $200 subscription. And I think now I think Claude introduced some Fable recently. And that is not a part of subscription. That is based on how much use you have and you'll build for that. So that will be super expensive, I think. And they say this is very good. I haven't tested it, but for chemical problems, but most likely it is very good. But it's really good at mathematics. So I stopped contacting mathematicians. I had a library of mathematicians to contact. I knew this one's the expertise of this person. This person can answer that question. That is over. AI has taken that place. So yes, chromatographer can educate themselves with that. Another thing which I can use your platform to emphasize is that in the 70s, 80s, or even 90s, there were courses called mathematics for chemists or mathematics for analytical chemistry. That concept has vanished over time. I cannot find any course like that, or signal processing for analytical chemists. Especially in the US, chemometrics side is going very weak, and the European side is focusing on chemometrics. So you find very good chemometricians Most of the good experts have retired from the, like, they were really great. Tom O'Haver is one of them, Edward Whiteman, and but they're retired, so they're no longer active. But there is no current generation among analytical chemists who focus exactly on signal processing techniques, digital processing techniques. I hope if I use this platform, somebody can develop courses which focus on advanced, not trivial denoising problems or moving averages, like really advanced chemometric 2 semester course, and make a foundation in the first semester for mathematics like linear algebra, optimization theory, statistics, and then in the second semester teach how to use AI properly. So that would be a good foundation. It's very sad, really sad reality that there are people, there are students who are who find it challenging to do dilution calculations. So how can I expect them to know a very advanced denoiser based on optimization, right? So the mathematics training has to be there if you want to become a good analytical chemist. An analytical chemist must know physics, little bit of physics. If you do not know the instruments, a diffraction grating, for example, what's the point? You're clicking buttons. Yes, anyone else can do that too, but you will not be able to innovate in that area. So you should know a little bit of physics, little bit of mathematics, and little bit of coding, which will help, right?
Yeah, I'll add something to the AI discussion here. As for said, I was a skeptic, but then again, a couple of years ago, the AIs hallucinated more than they actually produced anything of value. That doesn't happen anymore. They don't hallucinate. They've become much more coherent and they have become much more efficient and they can do massive jobs with no errors. That's
Hmm.
new. And a lot of that has happened in months, not years. So
Yeah.
the AI has changed. So yes, I was a skeptic and I thought I had a valid reason for it. I just never
Mhm.
expected the world to change as it has. Now I have a business partner, Hugh Barron Marceau. He works at Phytochemia and actually founded the company up in Canada in Quebec. And he probably knows more about practical side of lab chromatography than anyone I've met. He's very good at it. He's an AI, his AI goes far beyond mine, and I have used it incredibly extensively. We've created a PeakLab version for AI that will basically be accessible by the Python agents that AI uses to process the mathematics. And we basically added the Agilent support for so we could go out and collect all of the Agilent files he has in his company, which is easily tens of thousands of data sets, and
Mhm.
access them. So the moment you put AI on the system, it now has its thumb on 10,000 or 30,000 data sets instantly.
Mhm.
And you can ask it, go out and get those 30,000 data sets, run it through the API to do the modeling, store all of that modeling in an SQL database that I will then have you access. And I want to create a neural net predictive system based upon the parameters that I've gotten from that model. I would have thought that would have been like a 2035 kind of thing if I lived long enough to even see something like that. But that's happening today. This thing is going so fast and so effectively that the people that know how to use AI are going to be outperforming the people who do not by a margin I wouldn't have dreamed possible even 6 months ago. And that's how fast this world is changing. And I see it firsthand. I see the capabilities, and it's almost like you're in a state of disbelief because you
Mhm.
don't expect that kind of evolution to happen. It's not even an evolution anymore. It's not a revolution because it's just happening way too quickly. And
Mhm.
the question is, how do you stay caught up with what is all of a sudden being put in front of us? So the science of laboratories are going to change immensely with the people that know how to use it, and those who don't, I wouldn't recommend it. I'll just put it that way. I wouldn't recommend sitting on the sidelines any longer because of all the issues that existed just a couple of years ago. Because they don't any, the world has drastically changed.
Right. It is hurting new generation, David, really badly because they're becoming too dependent. Like, even as I said, dilution calculation, calibration calculations, they're dependent on AI to do that. And if you rely that much, that is not going anywhere. That's a destruction of education system. So that's why I see there is an in the academic side there is resentment of using AI. But if you use, everything has good and bad use, right? like internet. If you use it for good purposes, that's good, the best thing to ever have. And if you use it for chatting and wasting your time in, that's the worst thing you can have in your life as well.
Any closing thoughts that either one of you had that we should include in this episode?
Yeah, obviously I'm not a young person anymore, but this is an exciting era in terms of the laboratory sciences, in terms of the technology that's out there. I'm in the middle of being able to work with this and see it firsthand, and it's the world is changing. I guess that's the main message I've got. That and there's a lot of resistance in science to change,
Yes.
massive resistance.
Mhm.
And AI is certainly deemed to be a threat to intelligent science or
Mhm.
just to intelligent researchers. But an intelligent researcher that knows how to do that can accomplish in a month what might take a lifetime. Seriously, what might take a lifetime. It's an exciting time because one person can make much more of a difference than they could in the past if they're creative and they know what they want, they understand what they want. And as Farooq said, they have a real foundation. They understand analytics, they understand chemistry, they understand laboratory science, they understand the mathematical sciences, they understand the computer sciences.
Mhm.
They
Mhm.
understand how AI is working in this next generation. It is a brave new world, it's exciting to be a part of it.
My audience will be younger students, so I will tell them don't rely too much on AI. For example, I've on LinkedIn I see that people say, hey, AI can summarize 10 papers for me. You have to learn the art of reading, right? And one thing where AI has really helped is catching thieves, of in the sense that a lot of papers in chemometrics, people think it's mathematics. They can be fake too, like in the sense that data manipulation exists. That's very common, and wrong codes. And that was a surprise to me that people intentionally posted wrong codes in the supporting files that nobody else can verify. Right now, I can in a published paper, I can post it on the AI and ask if there are mistakes. And I caught in a very good journal that code was intentionally wrong, and it could have never worked the way they shared it. So to use AI
Well, I mean,
intelligently,
how many different papers have you reviewed in the last decade
I
or
would
so?
say in a decade I would have more than, I think around more than 200 maybe.
So he was the first to educate me on the fact that there's a lot of fraudulent science being published these days. I just assumed that you publish something fraudulent, you're basically blacklisted and you disappear from the scientific universe. The idea
Not
that's
anymore.
not anymore was a new revelation to me because I just the old school. I just thought there was a lot of peer review
Because
quality still in place.
Ron, in
Which is
your time,
me and saying no, it's not.
one paper was enough for a PhD, right? Now it is three papers, four papers. So there is compromise in quality. And if money is associated with publication, as some universities do in certain part of the world. Like if you publish in Nature, you get this amount of money. If you publish in Science, you get this amount of money. And when money is associated with anything, there will be some bad actors.
This has been great. I really appreciate your time. Ron,
Thank you.
Farooq, thank you so much for joining me today.
We
Thank you very
appreciate
much.
the opportunity to share all of our opinions.